Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, Second Lecture, Merkabah Mysticism and Jewish Gnosticism. 1. First phase in the development of Jewish mysticism before its crystallization in the medieval Kabbalah is also the longest. Its literary remains are traceable over a period of almost 1,000 years, from the 1st century BCE to the 10th of the Common Era, and some of its important records have survived. Now, Judaism by name can be traced now to the 2nd century BCE, and about 540 BCE, something that we can call Judaism, after the encounter with the Mobeds of Persia and the reblending in of what they were trying to separate from among the Semites. In spite of its length and notwithstanding the fluctuations of the historical process, there is every justification for treating it as a single distinct phase between the physiognomy of early Jewish mysticism and that of medieval Kabbalism. There is a difference which time has not effaced. It is not my intention here to follow the movement through its various stages from its early beginnings in the period of the Second Temple to its gradual decline and disappearance. To do so would involve a lengthy excursion into historical and philological detail, much of which has not yet been sufficiently clarified. What I propose to do is to analyze the peculiar realm of religious experience which is reflected in the more important documents of the period. I do not therefore intend to give much space to hypothesis concerning the origins of Jewish mysticism and its relation to Greco-Oriental syncretism, fascinating though the subject may be. Nor am I going to deal with many pseudo-epigraphic and apocalyptic works, such as the Ethiopic Book of Enoch and the 4th Book of Ezra, which undoubtedly contain elements of Jewish mystical religion. Their influence on the subsequent development of Jewish mysticism cannot be overlooked, but in the main I shall confine myself to the analysis of writings to which little attention has hitherto been given in the literature on Jewish religious history, and of course the exclusion of those books that might have been considered canonical, were considered. In turning our attention to the subject, we are at once made aware of the unfortunate fact that practically nothing is known about those who espouse the oldest organized movement of Jewish mysticism in the late Talmudic and post-Talmudic times, i.e. the period from which the most illuminating documents have come down to us. Like the authors of the biblical Apocrypha and pseudo-epigrapha, they have generally followed the practice of concealing their identity behind the great names of the past. There is little hope that we shall ever learn the true identity of the men who were the first to make an attempt, still recognizable and describable, to invest Judaism with the glory of mystical splendor. It is only by accident that certain names from among the mystics of the later period have been preserved. Thus, we hear of Joseph ben Abba, who was head of the Rabbinical Academy of Bethesda around 1814 of the Common Era, who is said to have been versed in mystical lore. Another name which occurs with some frequency is that of Aaron ben Samuel of Baghdad, the father of mysteries. Although his individuality disappears behind an iridescent haze of legends, there is no doubt that he was instrumental in bringing a knowledge of the mystical tradition, such as it had by that time in Mesopotamia to southern Italy, and thence to the Jews of Europe. But these are men of the 9th century, that is to say, of a time when this particular form of mysticism was already fully developed and in certain respects even on the decline. For its classical period, approximately from the 4th to the 6th century of the Common Era, we are left completely in the dark as to the leading figures. It is true that we know the names of some of the Talmudic authorities of the 4th century who made a study of the secret doctrine, men like Rava and his contemporary Aha ben Jacob, but we have no means of knowing whether they were in any way connected with the groups of Jewish Gnostics whose writings are in our hands. Palestine was the cradle of the movement. That much is certain. We also know the names of the most important representatives of mystical and theosophical thought among the teachers of the Mishnah. They belong to a group of the pupils of Johanan ben Zakkai around the turn of the 1st century of the Common Era. There is good reason to believe that important elements of this spiritual tradition were kept alive in small esoteric circles. The writers who, at the end of the Talmudic epoch, attempted a synthesis of their new religious faith and thereby laid the foundations of an entirely new literature appear to have received important suggestions from this quarter. As we have seen, these writers no longer appear under their own names but under those of Johanan ben Zakkai, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Akka ben Joseph, and Ishmael, the high priest. These authentic personages are at the same time introduced as the chief characters of their writings, the heroes of mystical action, the keepers and trustees of secret wisdom. Not all of this is mere romancing, but it is impossible to treat the bulk of it as authentic. A good deal undoubtedly pertains to latter stages of development in which older motifs have acquired a new significance or revealed new aspects. If the roots in many cases go far back, they do not necessarily go back to these orthodox rabbinic teachers of the Mishnaic period. Subterranean but effective and occasionally still traceable connections exist between these latter mystics and the groups which produced a large proportion of the pseudepigrapha and apocalypses of the 1st century before and after Christ. And by saying that, they mean, the Christians believe that there were one, but the Jews believe that there were a whole bunch of them, even if you go from tonic alone, So it doesn't mean the same thing to them. The Christians don't take the term literally. Subsequently, a good deal of this unrecognized tradition made its way to the latter generations, independent of and often in isolation from the schools and academics and academies of the Talmudic teachers. We know that in the period of the Second Temple, an esoteric doctrine was already taught in Pharisaic circles. The 1st chapter of Genesis, the story of creation, Masah, Bereshith, and the 1st chapter of Ezekiel, the vision of God's throne chariot, the Merkabah, were the favorite subjects of discussion and interpretation which it was apparently considered inadvisable to make public. Originally, these discussions were restricted to the elucidation and exposition of the respective biblical passages. Thus, St. Jerome, in one of his letters, mentions a Jewish tradition which forbids the study of the beginning and the end of the book of Ezekiel before the completion of the 3rd year. It seems probable, however, that speculation did not remain restricted to commentaries on the biblical text. The Hayoth, the living creatures, and other objects of Ezekiel's vision were conceived as angels who form an angelic hierarchy at the celestial court. As long as our knowledge is confined to the meager fragmentary material scattered across different parts of the Talmud and the Midrashim, we shall probably be unable to say how much of this is mystical and theosophical speculation in the strictest sense. It is a well-known fact that the editor of the Mishnah, the patriarch Jehuda, the saint, a pronounced rationalist, did all he could to exclude references to the Merkabah, the angelology, etc. And I imbibed one of my tarot series with angelology, the tarot of the dead. A good deal of this material has been preserved in a second Mishnah collection, the so-called Tosefta, and it is from this that other fragments that we are able to draw some inferences concerning the character of these speculations. Our task in this respect would undoubtedly be considerably facilitated if we could be sure that certain apocryphal works written around similar themes, such as the Book of Enoch or the Apocalypse of Abraham, to mention only some of the most outstanding, reproduce the essentials of the esoteric doctrine taught by the teachers of the Mishnah, but it is precisely here that we are left in the dark. Although an immense literature has grown up on the subject of this apocrypha, the truth is that no one knows for certain to what extent they reflect views shared by the Mishnaic authorities. Be that as it may, and even granted that it may be possible to trace the influence of the Essenes in some of these writings, one fact remains certain: the main subjects of the later Merkabah mysticism already occupy a central position in this oldest esoteric literature, best represented by the Book of Enoch. The combination of apocalyptic with theosophy and cosmogony is emphasized almost to excess. Not only have the seers perceived the celestial host, heaven with its angels, but the whole of this apocalyptic and pseudo-epigraphic literature is shot through with the chain of new revelations concerning the hidden glory of the great majesty, its throne, its palace, and so on. The celestial spheres towering up one over the other, paradise, hell, and the containers of the souls. There's dots, but there's, this is a quote, not only, so part of the quotes. This is entirely correct and by itself sufficient to prove the essential continuity of thought concerning of the old apocalyptics. The Merkabah speculation of the Mishnaic teachers who are known to us by name, and the Merkabah mysticism of late and post-Talmudic times is reflected in the literature which has come down to us. We are dealing here with a religious movement of distinctive character whose existence conclusively disproves the old prejudice according to which all the productive religious energies of early apocalyptic were absorbed by and into Christianity after the latter's rise. 2. What was the central theme of these oldest of mystical doctrines within the framework of Judaism? No doubts are possible on this point. The earliest Jewish mysticism is throne mysticism. Its essence is not absorbed contemplation of God's true nature, but perception of his appearance on the throne as described by Ezekiel. Well, what if the thing on the throne wasn't God? But anyways. And cognition of the mysteries of the celestial throne world. The throne world is to the Jewish mystic what the pleroma, the fullness, the bright sphere of divinity with its potencies, ions, archons, and dominions, is to the Hellenistic and early Christian mystics of the period, who appear in the history of religion under the names of Gnostics and Hermetics. And considering that that was what was going on when the people wrote the Christian side of the Bible, perhaps that's how we should interpret the use of those words, right? I mean, there's more words than that, but yeah. The Jewish mystic, though guided by motives similar to theirs, nevertheless express his vision in terms of his own religious background, God's pre-existing throne, which embodies and exemplifies all forms of creation, is at once the goal and the theme of his mystical vision. From the 14th chapter of the Ethiopic book of Enoch, which contains the oldest description of the throne in the whole of this literature, a long succession of mystical documents of the most varied character, leads to the ecstatic descriptions of the throne world in the tracts of the Merkabah visionaries, to which we must now turn our attention. From the interpretation of the throne world as the true center of all mystical conception is possible to deduce most of the concepts and doctrines of these ancient mystics. The following is therefore an excursion through the manifold variations on the one theme which forms their common point of departure. The outstanding documents of the movement appear to have been edited in the 5th and 6th centuries, when its spirit was still alive and vigorous. It is difficult to establish exact dates for the various writings, but everything points to the period before the expansion of Islam. Well, Islam as far as with the Quran. And Islam went much further than the enemies. Somebody who met Muhammad went up to Siberia. People who met them, that generation, and so on, went even to America, 2 generations on. The world reflected in this literature has evoked in the mind of more than one scholar comparisons with the pattern of Byzantine society. There is no reason for assuming that the descriptions of the celestial throne and the heavenly court simply reflect the mundane reality of the Byzantine or Sassanid court, if only because the roots of their central theme go much too far back for such a hypothesis. At the same time, there can be no reasonable doubt that the atmosphere of these writings is in harmony with contemporary political and social conditions. All our material is in the form of brief tracts or scattered fragments of varying length from what may have been voluminous works. In addition, there is a good deal of almost shapeless literary raw material. Much of this literature has not yet been published, and the history of many texts still await clarification. Most of the tracts are called Hekaloth books, i.e. descriptions of the Hekaloth, the heavenly halls or palaces through which the visionary passes, and in the seventh and last of which there arises the throne of divine glory. One of them, whose title, Book of Enoch, appears to belong to a very late period, was edited in 1928 by the Swedish scholar Hugo Odeberg. Of still greater importance than this book are the so-called Greater Hekaloth and Lesser Hekaloth. The Hebrew text of both tracts is available, unfortunately, only in very corrupt editions, which still await a critical edition as much as a translation. If this task were undertaken, a good deal of light would be thrown on a startling and remarkable chapter in the history of ancient Gnosticism. In the present context, with our chief interest restricted to the ideas of the mystics who were the authors of these writings, there is no room for a discussion of the rather intricate questions connected with the probable origin and composition of these texts. My own views on this subject are rather different from the very scholarly interpretation put forward by Odeberg. The so-called Third Book of Enoch, which Odeberg attributes to the 3rd century, appears to me to belong to a later period than the Greater Hekaloth. The later, in their turn, come after the Lesser Hekaloth, the oldest text available to us, in which Rabbi Akiba appears as the principal speaker. The texts of the Greater Hekaloth, with Rabbi Ishmael as the speaker, are made up of several different strata. They even include a compilation of materials, particularly in the chapters 17 to 23, which go back in part to the 2nd century, but in their present form, including certain apocalyptic revelations, they can hardly have been edited before the 6th. Generally speaking, these documents reflect different stages of development. Although some of them may have coexisted with others, a good deal of precious old material is whirled along in this stream. Not a few allusions to ideas apparently common in these circles have no meaning for us, but what interests us chiefly, the spiritual physiognomy and the religious mentality of these groups, is clear and understandable enough in this connection. One important point is to be noted. The most important of these old tracts and compilations, such as the Greater and Lesser Hekaloth, are precisely those which are almost entirely free from the exegetical element. These texts are not midrashim, i.e. expositions of biblical passages, but a literature Swede generous with a purpose of its own. They are essentially descriptions of a genuine religious experience for which no sanction is sought in the Bible. In short, they belong in one class with the Apocrypha and the apocalyptic writings, rather than with the traditional Midrash. It is true that the vision of the celestial realm, which forms their main theme, originally produced from an attempt to transform what is casually alluded to in the Bible into direct personal experience. Similarly, the basic categories of thought which appear in the description of the Merkabah are derived from the same biblical source, but for all that, one meets here with an entirely new and independent spiritual and religious mood. Only in the latter stages of the movement, probably corresponding with its gradual decline, do the writings show a return to exegesis for its own sake. The descriptions given to the contemplation of God's glory and the celestial throne employ a terminology which has varied in the course of the centuries. In the period of the Mishnah, reference is usually made to a theosophic study of glory or an understanding of the glory. We even find the curious term employment of the glory in connection with Rabbi Akiba, who was found worthy of it. Later, the Hekaloth tracts usually speak of the vision of the Merkabah, the sphere of the throne. The Merkabah has its chambers, and later on its palaces, a concept foreign to Ezekiel and the early writers generally. Well, the person who wrote Ezekiel, that's different than Ezekiel, but anyways. Yitzhak, is how you pronounce that. According to an Aggadic tradition from the 4th century, Isaac had a vision on Moriah, the moment when Abraham was about to perform the sacrifice in which his soul received the chambers of the Merkabah. At different times, the visionary experience is also interpreted differently. In the early literature, the writers always speak of an ascent to the Merkabah, a pictorial analogy. which has come to seem natural to us. The lesser Hekaloth emphasize this ascent, and the same term recurs in a few out-of-the-way passages of the Greater Hekaloth, and in the introduction to the Book of Enoch, but for the reasons which have become obscure, the whole terminology had in the meantime undergone a change. It is difficult to say exactly when, probably around 500, in the Greater Hekaloth, which are of such importance for our analysis, and from then on in almost all the later writings, the visionary journey of the soul to heaven is always referred to as the descent to the Merkabah. The paradoxical character of this term is all the more remarkable because the detailed description of the mystical process nonetheless constantly employs the metaphor of ascent and not of descent. The mystics of this group call themselves Yordeh Merkabah, i.e., descenters to the Merkabah, and not riders in the chariot, as some translators would have it. Well, calling it a ride doesn't necessarily mean that sense either. And this name is also given, but we also got to look at the difference between Hebrew and Aramea, which the books of Tanakh were written. I mean, it was called Aramea in the pre-Talmudic times, so yeah. And in the times of the earliest writings of these texts, so yeah. And this name is also given to them by others throughout the whole literature down to a late period. The authors of the Greater Hekaloth refer to the existence of these Yordeh Merkabah as a group with some sort of organization and identify them with the usual legendary fashion with the circle of Johanan ben Zakkai and his disciples. Since the Greater Hekaloth contain Palestinian as well as Babylonian elements, the earliest chapters in particular bear unmistakable traces in their subject matter as well as their style of Palestinian influence. It is not inconceivable that the organization of these groups did indeed take place in late Talmudic times, 4th or 5th century, on Palestinian soil. As a matter of ascertained fact, however, we only know of their existence in Babylonia, from where practically all mystical tracts of this particular variety made their way to Italy and Germany. It is these tracts that have come down to us in the form of manuscripts written in the late Middle Ages. To repeat, we are dealing with organized schools which foster and hand down a certain tradition with a school of mystics who are not prepared to reveal their secret knowledge, their gnosis, to the public. Too great was the danger in this period of ubiquitous Jewish and Christian heresies that mystical speculation based on private religious experience would come into conflict with that rabbinical Judaism which was rapidly crystallizing during the same epoch. The Greater Hekaloth shows in many and often highly interesting details that their anonymous authors were anxious to develop their gnosis within the framework of Halakhic Judaism, notwithstanding its partial incompatibility with the new religious spirit. The original religious impulses active in these circles came after all the sources quite different from those of Orthodox Judaism. One result of this peculiar situation was the establishment of certain conditions of admission into the circle of the Merkabah mystics. The Talmudic sources already mentioned certain stipulations, albeit of a very general character, in accordance with which admission to the knowledge of the theosophical doctrines and principles is made conditional on the possession of certain moral qualities. Only a court president or one belonging to the categories of men named in Isaiah 3:3 is found worthy of obtaining insight into the tradition of Merkabah Mysticism. Chapter 13 of the Greater Hekaloth lists 8 moral requisites of initiation. In addition, however, we find physical criteria which have nothing to do with the moral or social status of the acolyte. In particular, the novice is judged in accordance with physiognomic and chiromantic criteria, a novel procedure which appears to have been stimulated by the renaissance of Hellenistic physiognomics and in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Apart from being a criterion for the admission of novices, physiognomy and chiromancy also figure in Hekaloth mysticism as a subject of esoteric knowledge among the adepts. It is therefore not surprising that several manuscripts have retained a sort of introduction in the form of a chiromantic fragment. Incidentally, the oldest chiromantic document known to us, since no Assyrian or Greco-Roman texts of this kind have been preserved, this preamble to the other Hekaloth books interprets the significance of the favorable or unfavorable lines of the human hand without reference to astrology, but on the basis of a fixed terminology which to us is frequently obscure. One is perhaps justified in regarding the appearance of these new criteria as a parallel to the growth of Neoplatonic mysticism in the Orient during the 4th century. It is characteristic of this period that Gemblicus, in his biography of Pythagoras, a book which throws a good deal more light on the period of its writing than on its subject matter, asserts that entry into the Pythagorean school was conditional upon the possession of certain physiognomic characteristics. The above-mentioned fragment, in which the angel Surya reveals to Ishmael one of the two principal figures of our Hekaloth tracts, the secrets of chiromancy and physiognomy, has a title taken from Isaiah 3:9. Hekarath panim, i.e. the perception of the face. And in fact, this passage from Isaiah first received a physiognomic interpretation in the 4th century of the Common Era as a Talmudic reference to the subject shows. Part 3 of this. Those who passed the test were considered worthy to make the descent to the Merkabah, which led them after many trials and dangers through the 7 heavenly palaces, and before that, through the heavens. Their preparation, their technique, and description of what is perceived on the voyage are the subject matter of the writings which we are concerned. Originally, we have here a Jewish variation on one of the chief preoccupations of the 2nd and 3rd century Gnostics and Hermeneutics, the ascent of the soul from the earth through the spheres of the hostile planet angels and rulers of the cosmos, and its return to its divine home in the fullness of God's light, a return which to the Gnostics' mind signified redemption. Some scholars consider this to be the central idea of Gnosticism. Certainly the description of this journey, of which a particularly impressive account is found in the 2nd part of the Greater Hekaloth, is, in all its details, of a character which must be called Gnostic. This mystical ascent is always preceded by ascetic practices whose duration in some cases is 12 days, and others 40. An account of these practices was given about 1000 of the Common Era by Hai ben Sherira, the head of a Babylonian academy. According to him, many scholars were of the belief that one who is distinguished by many qualities described in the books, and who is desirous of beholding the Merkabah and the palaces of the angels on high, must follow a certain procedure. He must fast a number of days and lay his head between his knees and whisper many hymns and songs whose texts are known from tradition. Then he perceives the interior and the chambers, as if he saw 7 palaces with his own eyes, and it is as though he entered one palace after the other and saw what is there. The typical bodily posture of these ascetics is also that of Elijah in his prayer on Mount Carmel. It is an attitude of deep self-oblivion, which, to judge from certain ethnological parallels, is favorable to the induction of pre-hypnotic autosuggestion. Denys gives a very similar description of a Chinese somnambulist in, in the act of the conjuring of the spirits of the departed. She sits down on a low chair and bends forward so that her head rests on her knees. Then in a deep measured voice she repeats 3 times an exorcism, whereupon a certain change appears to come over her. In the Talmud, too, we find this posture described as typical of the self-oblivion of a Hanana Bendosa, sunken prayer, or of a penitent who gives himself over to God. Finally, after such preparations, and in a state of ecstasy, the adept begins his journey. The Greater Hekaloth do not describe the details of his ascent through the 7 heavens, but they do describe his voyage through the 7 palaces, situated in the highest heaven, the place of the Gnostical rulers, archons of the 7 planetary spheres who are opposed to the liberation of the soul from its earthly bondage, and whose resistance the soul must overcome, is taken in this Judaized and monotheistic Gnosticism by the hosts of gatekeepers, posted to the right and left of the entrance to the heavenly hall, through which the soul must pass in its ascent. In both cases, the soul requires a pass in order to be able to continue its journey without danger. A magical seal made of a secret name which puts the demons and hostile angels to flight. Every new stage of the ascension requires a new seal with which the traveler seals himself, in order that, to quote a fragment, he shall not be dragged into the fire and the flame, the vortex and the storm which are around thee, O thou terrible and sublime. The Greater Hekaloth have preserved a quite pedantic description of this passport procedure. All the seals and secret names are derived from the Merkabah itself, where they stand like pillars of flame around the fiery throne of the Creator. It is the soul's need for protection on its journey which has produced these seals with their twin functions as a protective armor and as a magical weapon. At first, the magical protection of a single seal may be sufficient, but as time goes on, the difficulties experienced by the adept tend to become greater. A brief and simple formula is no longer enough. Sunk in his ecstatic trance, the mystic at the same time experiences a sense of frustration which he tries to overcome by using longer and more complicated magical formulae, symbols of a longer and harder struggle to pass the closed entrance gates, which block his progress. As his psychical energy wanes, the magical strain grows, and the conjuring gesture becomes progressively more strained until, in the end, whole pages are filled with an apparently meaningless recital of magical keywords with which he tries to unlock the closed door. It is this fact which explains the abundance of magical elements in many of the Hekaloth texts. And I guess I'll share some more of the notes from one here. Molitor's Philosophy, Geschichte, Volume 2, 1834. Let us not fall into the idea that all these things have meaning. Now, it could have been composed just to be meaningless to prove submission, but in Semitic languages, everything has meaning. Market Halahut describes ascribes sometimes to Perez, Barcelona, Mantua, 1558, folio 82b, Da, Ki, Hain, Suf, Asher, Zerkernu, Einanu, Ramuz, La, Batura, Wala, Bunyaim, Wala,